to start today. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. Yes, I'm Marilyn, Watkins, and I'm from the Economic Opportunity Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research and advocacy organization that's located in Seattle. And we focus mostly on state-level issues concerning educational opportunity for everyone and rebuilding the American middle class, creating the kind of economic policies that really foster opportunity and success broadly for everybody. One of the issues we talk about a lot is state tax policy, and so that's what I'll be focusing on today. And I brought some sign-up sheets. We have a email newsletter that goes out about every 2 weeks. The executive director of my organization has a column in the Everett paper every 2 weeks, and so when that comes out, we send out a little email alert that has that column as well as any other reports or other things that we've put out recently and other things that may be of interest. So if you're interested in getting that, you can sign up for that. And also, one of the issues that we do a lot of work on is access to paid leave. And I don't know if any of you in the Seattle area may have seen on the news this week that there's actually a campaign for paid sick days in Seattle that's just getting started. And there's going to be a community forum about that on May 11th in the U District from 5 to 7. And so I have some flyers for that event on May 11th at 5 o'clock in the U District in Seattle. So if any of you live or work in Seattle and are interested in that and you want to get a flyer, you can come up and see me at the end of the thing. So, I'm afraid I don't really have answers for you today. You'll notice there's a question mark on this presentation. Can we fund the education system that our children need? And it's kind of an open question, and it's really up to us, I think, whether we're going to be able to do that or not. So I'm afraid that today I'm going to be more describing the depth and range of the problem that we're facing and some possibilities for directions that we can move forward, but without any specifics. And our system seems to be frozen here now, so let's see.
Is your slideshow on the...
No, and my slideshow isn't on the thumb drive. I was hoping to wait till the end of the legislative session when the budget had been adopted so that I could incorporate that in. So I just ignored the cutoff date, and then of course the legislature hasn't adopted a budget yet, so I guess I could have actually done this back whenever. But I didn't, so that's one of the things you can note on the sign-up sheet as it goes around. If you want to get a copy of it and you're putting your email address down, then I can send it to you after the fact. So I apologize for that. I'd like to, well, I'll wait just a second while people are getting settled here, because we have another stream of people coming in. So those of you coming in late, the sign-up sheet has two things that you can note on there. One of them is if you'd like a copy of the presentation, you can request it on there as long as you put your email address on. And the other thing is if you'd like the Economic Opportunity Institute's newsletter that comes out by email every 2 weeks, you can also indicate that on there as well. So I'd like to start out presentations about tax and revenue policy by starting with a bigger frame, because I think it's really easy to start immediately into some of the specifics and get lost in the weeds and forget why it is we have government and public revenue to begin with. It's probably here at the PTA you're a little bit more up to speed on one of the main reasons we have government, since you're all very much involved in your children's public schools. But in the words of the United States Constitution, we have government, and therefore we have taxes to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. I mean, we have government and we have taxes because there are a lot of things that we can do together that we aren't able to do individually. And let's see, this is being really and of course, here in Washington State, and you probably all know this as well, and many of you may be able to, you might have to recite this in order to qualify to come to the PTA convention. It is the paramount duty of the state of Washington to make ample provision for the education of all children residing within its borders without distinction or preference on account of race, color, caste, or sex, which is a pretty remarkable, sweeping statement. Sort of given the context and given that we're having this discussion at the same time that we're hearing so much about the federal deficit and the conversation going on in Washington, D.C. about taxes and deficits and budgets and what can we really afford, and are we at a place where we just need to reset government and really think about doing things entirely differently and cutting back on all of our expectations? Is that where we really are today? I wanted to I'll confess at this point that my background is actually as a historian. My PhD is in history, not in economics, as many people assume given what I do. This is my little attempt to throw a little history into this. Kind of thinking back in a generational view of things. People who are seniors today grew up during a time during and after the Depression, and then they built their families in the sort of this post-World War II era, when we had a really vigorous government that was making major investments in individuals and in the economy, building the interstate highway systems, sending men to the moon, and all of the science investments that went into that, doing the GI Bill. Here in Washington State, we built the entire community college system. There were a lot of investments that both the federal and the state governments were making that expanded opportunity and really helped build up the middle class. So we had a long period during the middle part of the 20th century when the middle class was growing in our country, and we had strong public schools. We had a lot of problems in our society. I'm not saying it was a perfect time, but we had a growing opportunity for people, and it was based in part, not entirely, but part of it was premised. The foundation was these broad, strong public investments that were being made. Since the 1980s, we've had a gradual decrease in that at both the federal and the state level. And at the federal level, we've had lowered taxes from 1980 onward for the most part. We've had a continual attack on government, so government is not your friend, government is the problem. And during that time period, we've seen growing inequality and increasing economic insecurity for a lot of people. That's some of the context that we're dealing with, and in which we have to, here in Washington State, as we're making decisions about how to fund education, we also have to be making decisions about what we want our state government to be doing and how we're going to fund all of the things that the state government wants to do. And you may disagree with a lot of what I conclude, but we're making some pretty major decisions here. We're at a time where we're not talking about incrementalism. We're talking about really thinking through what it is we want to do collectively as a state, as well as a nation. So, of course, the recession is a huge part of the immediate problem that we're facing now, and it's a huge part of the immediate problem that the state legislature is currently having with adopting a budget for the next biennium. But the problem in funding education in our state is not related only to the recession. We have a longer-term problem here. And what this graph here shows is the declining rank of Washington State relative to the other states in the United States in terms of the way we fund education. The total amount of dollars going into education, the combination of state, local, and federal dollars going into K-12 education here in our state. And there's two different measures, and this is from the U.S. Census Bureau, who conducts these annual surveys of public education systems. So this graph here shows us, measures our investment in public education relative to the other states compared to our total wealth as a state, compared to $1,000 of state personal income. It's a very common measure that's used. And as you can see, in 1991, we were right about in the middle, 24th. By 2007, 2008, we had fallen to 47th. The other measure then that's commonly used is per pupil spending, because of course different states have different amounts of income. Washington is a much wealthier state than many of the southern states and more rural states are. So we don't look quite as bad if we look at it per pupil, but we don't look all that great, even if we look at it per pupil. We started out in 1991 at 17th, and by 2007, 2008, which is the last year for which we have data from the Census Bureau, we had fallen to 35th.
Doesn't really mean anything though, unless you have actual numbers. Maybe for all you know, the per pupil spending has doubled.
Well, let's look and see at that very thing.
Excellent.
Point here. Yes, thank you. And so this shows that spending per $1,000 of state personal income as a dollar figure. And so the red bar here is the United States average, the U.S. average, which you can see has stayed pretty steady, relatively steady. And I'm sorry, I kept trying to change that and it kept not changing. And the blue one, which you see descending gradually, is Washington State, how much we spend on K-12 education per $1,000 of state personal income. And here in 1991, we started at $44, and we've fallen almost 10 full dollars to $34.58 by the 2007-2008 school year. Now, I think you probably are all well aware that in the last couple of years, we've had some major cuts in spending and on K-12, as well as in other areas of state government. And so the two big education initiatives that passed about a decade ago now, Initiative 728, the class size reduction and student achievement initiative, that's been suspended, as well as the teacher cost of living, automatic teacher cost of living increase has also been suspended for the last 2 years, and is certainly going to be the case in the next biennium's budget as well. That's going to be a big chunk of what they do to save money. That's just a done deal, basically. But they've made a lot of other cuts as well in all sorts of other areas. And of course, it's not just in K-12. There's been a lot of reduction in higher ed spending as well. And then, I think you probably heard some of this in some of your other sessions, there's a lot of unfunded commitments that we have, as a state, have made. We've made some pretty good policy decisions in terms of what we'd like to do as a state. Not just in K-12, but in major investments in early learning, as well as major expansions in higher education. And basically, none of that's funded at this point, right? So the basic ed reform, most of that remains unfunded. The commitment to full-day kindergarten, we've made a start, but there again, the easy thing to suspend, something you're not yet doing. We've committed to providing preschool for all kids that need it in order to really succeed well in K-12 system by 2018, but we haven't even started the down payment on that yet, really. We've also pledged as a state to increase the number of higher education degrees and certificates by 40%. And we're clearly not going to be making much progress in that. In fact, it's not just K-12 where we're not doing very well. We actually do pretty well in community college AA degrees relative to other states. We're at a much higher level there, but in terms of producing bachelor's degrees per 1,000 state residents of sort of a traditional age, 20 to 34-year-olds, we're 41st, and in producing graduate degrees, 42nd. So again, not doing great in higher education as well. We basically import. We rely on importing college grads into our state to populate all of those high-tech jobs that we like so much. And our funding of higher education has also been falling. Back in 1980, 81, what this graph shows is the relative amount the state of Washington puts in this is for the University of Washington, but it's similar for all of the campuses out there. How much the state of Washington puts in versus how much student tuition covers in terms of the cost of education for students at the UW. And so back in 1980, the state covered 75% of the cost. Students and their families were pointing up 25% of the cost. Now, students and their families, and this is 2007, 2008, before the 30% tuition increase that already happened, and before the next huge tuition increase that we are guaranteed to have as part of the next biennial budget, families were already contributing almost 2/3 of the cost of education at the UW. And what that means for families is, it's a lot more expensive relative to families' incomes. Now, family incomes have gone up over that time as well, but back in 1991,
Not that much was it?
not that much, exactly. Back in 1991, going to the University of Washington, tuition and fees at the University of Washington cost just about 6% of the median household income here in Washington State. Community college was 2.7% of median household income in the U.S. I mean, not in the U.S., here in Washington State. By 2010, these have doubled, more than doubled, so that by 2010 it took 15% of a household income to fund tuition and fees at the UW. So it's gotten a lot more expensive for people if you can get your kid in to the UW, for you to send them there. Okay, so this gives you a picture of what the state budget looks like. Two different pictures. We have the state general fund, which is the part of the budget that's funded by state taxes. So the taxes that we pay here in Washington State to our state government is this picture. And this other pie here shows with the federal dollars that we also receive. We obviously get a lot of federal dollars in, and a lot of that is, and most of that, almost all of that federal money is for very specific services. But for what the state itself spends, 44% is for K-12 education, about 10% for higher ed, about 1/3 for human services, and then everything else is everything else. So this just kind of gives you a sense of the deficit that the state has been grappling with over the last few years once the recession really hit. If you think back to the fall of 2008, the recession officially in the U.S. started actually right at the end of 2007. But here in Washington, we didn't really feel that yet. It was really when the whole financial crisis hit in the fall of 2008 that the bottom fell out of Washington's economy. We were kind of chugging along, losing steam, but not collapsing until the fall of 2008. So the recession-driven part of the problem that we're talking about now started during this biennium here. This is the one that we're currently in. The state budget, to remind you, begins July 1st and runs for 2 years through June 30th. So our current biennium runs till the end of June. The next biennium that they're trying to adopt a budget for now begins this July. So the first thing they had to do when they came back into session, into session in 2009, was actually cut the budget. The governor froze a lot of programs in the fall of 2008 when the economy started collapsing and revenue started falling pretty precipitously. They cut the budget some more when they got to Olympia in 2009, and then they had to adopt this budget that we're currently in. So this is the projection of what the budget would have been had they simply maintained programs at the level that they were at, with the expected increase in number of kids in schools, the expected change in prison population, the expected change in number of kids that were in foster care, all those kinds of expected caseload increases. If they just maintained the status quo, this is what they would have had. Basically, they cut all of this. We got this from federal funds, one-time federal state assistance funds, the green. This is what we actually brought in state revenue. The blue is what we actually ended up bringing in state revenue. So we made some really significant cuts during this biennium, but they were made a lot less harsh by a pretty big chunk of federal funds that not only came to the state, But also, there was also some offsetting things. The state could make some cuts because the federal government was giving schools, a lot of public school districts got federal funds, city and county governments got federal funds as well. So that really helped mitigate that problem. Of course, we're not expecting that to continue. Nobody is expecting any federal funds, any federal aid, well, except for the usual federal funds. We're not expecting that infusion of extra federal aid to come to the states or to the school districts or city and county governments in the 2011-2013 school year. They're going to all be expiring. So this is the problem that they're facing now. Again, this is what the budget would be if, after making the cuts they already made, they still, continued with funding things at the level given population increase and whatnot. But now they're going to have to make this additional cut as well.
I have a
I
question.
think that the state revenue is going to go back.
Yeah, that's my question. It looks the same as 0709.
Go up this much. Well, they do keep projecting, that the economy will eventually start recovering. And we do in fact have continued population growth throughout this time, right? The population's continued to grow,
Which costs the state more money.
which can cost the state more money. And so, part of the issue is that most other recessions we have started on an economic recovery much more quickly than we have a year ago when they were when they were finishing the session a year ago. The economy was actually starting to perk up. And so the economists that do all the projections, of course, they're projecting what the revenue is going to be. So they projected, okay, like most recessions, things are going to start picking up and continue on the upward track. And then it went up and then it went down again. And so, they've been just scrambling every time they make a projection. It turns out, whoops, we thought we were being really conservative and cautious. And these guys are smart guys, and they're not optimists, believe me. But the economy is starting to pick up now. I think eventually we're going to get out of the effects of the recession. But it may be that they come back after they finally adopt this budget. They may have to come back in 2012 when they get back there. They may have to be cutting some more because it may turn out that what they were projecting again didn't pan out. And are you wanting to ask a question?
Yeah. Frequently you'll hear that, well, we aren't really making cuts because we're increasing spending. We've described the various pressures that we're increasing our requirements for spending. Do you have or can it be developed something to